This is the Nucleate Podcast, the voice of the next generation of biotech leaders.
Welcome to the Nucleate Podcast. My name is Sam Kessel, and on this episode, we are hosting Claire Smith, a partner at Springtide Ventures, an early-stage TechBio venture fund that backs founders focusing on improving health and technology. Claire started out doing research in her undergrad as a biomedical engineer, and then moved to strategy at Clearview Consulting. She was an investor at Entera, and then acted as an operator as chief of staff at a microbiome startup. She's had a wide array of experiences before coming to Springtide to shape the next generation of biotech companies, and she is an active supporter of Nucleate. We had a fantastic episode, and we hope you enjoy it. All right, Claire, thank you so much for joining the Nucleate podcast.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm excited for the conversation today.
I think it's worth our audience noting that Claire's been on some panels for Nucleate before, so we really appreciate you being part of the community.
Oh, definitely. I think what you guys are doing is an incredible resource, not just to founders, but obviously to the venture community, and I'm always happy to help support.
From Clearview to Entera Capital, Meridian Street, as an operator at a microbiome startup, and now partner at Springtide, you've had a really wide array of experiences. I want to talk about how they all come into play for you at Springtide. How does it all connect together?
I guess to take it way back, when I was in college, I studied biological engineering. I graduated in 2010 from MIT when that was, I think it still is the newest major, but it was the third year of the major. We joked we were like guinea pigs. But at that point, I don't think anyone really knew what biological engineering was. It kind of got lumped in with biomedical engineering, much more on the device side. But I don't think people were thinking about biology as this input for a lot of machine learning, computational biology types of things. So reflecting over, the past 15 years or so, it's been kind of nice to finally have people understand what I do for a living, I guess. What is computational biology and what are the things it can lead to and the really powerful experiences. But I knew I didn't want to go into grad school. I knew I didn't want to pipette all day, but I was what do you do that's at that kind of intersection of science, business, technology, all those things. And so, I learned about Clearview. It was back in 2011 and joined, which was really exciting. Got to do a little bit of everything from R&D prioritization across different mechanisms of action, really science-driven work, to things that were more commercial, like lifecycle management for established brands, which was a great exposure to the behemoth that is pharma and what it takes for a drug to be successfully commercialized, which was just great exposure. Then I decided I wanted to see what life was like on the other side. I think, going to MIT, there's always sort of startups are really cool and interesting. And how do you do that in a drug development context? Or how do you, add value as early in your career, scientist or business person or whatever it is, and had the incredible opportunity to join a microbiome therapeutic startup as a chief of staff. It was at the time, microbiome was really hot and brand new and had so much promise. And by the way, I'm still a big microbiome believer. I think there's going to be really interesting things that come out of, the science there, interesting insights that will hopefully lead to advances to help patients. But at the time, it was kind of right when everybody started to have these clinical trial failures. Series trial failed, a bunch of others were kind of middling, and it was oh, this is a really, really tough time to be in the microbiome space. So we ended up getting merged into Finch Therapeutics, and I had worked pretty closely with our investor through that process, and I was their job looks cool. Let's go see what this venture capital thing is about. Joined Entera, which is a food and agriculture focused fund, investing in biotech for, what are white spaces is probably not quite the right term, but places that aren't, human therapeutics. There's biotech applications everywhere, from industrial biotech, food, crop protection, and animal health. So did some company creation there, which is a really interesting business model. Learned a ton about what it takes to start a company, to, invest and grow those businesses. But realized I missed human healthcare. So spent some time at a pre-seed fund out in New York, and then joined Springtide about 2 years ago.
Thank you for taking us through that. It's cool that you have perspectives from what mature companies think about as a consultant, thinking about those, like you mentioned, life cycle management plays, which I'm sure are a distant way off when you're working with the platform companies you work with now.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that perspective is helpful, thinking about market sizes, thinking about, I'm assuming some degree of market entry was
Mm-hmm.
also part of your experience there, and quickly assessing competitive landscapes and differentiation, I think is a core consulting skill set that I'm sure applied really well as a chief of staff and now as a venture capitalist as well. I think it's interesting on the microbiome space that you're talking about. I'm sure having some perspective now, and myself included, like having some perspective on different technologies. Like I learned that radio pharma or radio conjugated antibodies were being developed in the like 80s and 90s. Like, and now radioligand therapy is extremely popular. So it might have just been a company before its time in a way. Like certain technologies or insights are needed to be developed in order for microbiome to reach its full potential, because I think we all have heard really interesting studies about connections between gut microbiome and neurodegenerative diseases and a lot of human pathology. So I think it's just an evolving area that we need more knowledge to fully understand, and kind of goes to the point too with any technology. Some require some other step changes before the technology can be adopted the way that it needs to be or incorporated the way it needs to.
Totally. I mean, I think it's one of those instances of like there really aren't like overnight successes in our business, right? Like you can take a look at any technology, any like modality, and chances are like people have been talking about it for like 30 years and doing like the really hard work of advancing it, right? Like the first monoclonal antibody was in the 80s. I mean, it was a fully murine one, so obviously like not particularly successful. And then like you look at the end of the 90s where like you start to see the Humiras of the world, the Herceptins, and like all of a sudden like biologics are a thing. Like that doesn't happen overnight. Like it's many years of advances that like get us to a point where like all of a sudden now you see like biologics commercials on TV and you're not like, wow, like antibodies, like that's incredible. But like it is an incredible journey if you take a look at like the history of biotech, right?
Now I want to talk a little bit about the differences that you've experienced as a startup operator at Cristovo, right? And going through that merger, doing some company creation, and what perspectives you learned from that and how you're applying it now at Springtide.
Yeah, I mean, being an operator is founders have the hardest job in the world, and it's such a privilege to work with them and support them. And, I'm not just saying that in like a lip service, VC being founder friendly way. Like, I think, being on the other side in any capacity, it just gives you tremendous empathy for like how hard it is to like conceptualize and build and like do the hard work day to day. Like, it's not just, the good moments of, founding your company and like, ringing the bell on NASDAQ or like ringing the bell for IPO or, and, all the like big newsworthy moments. Like it's all the hard work in between. And I think like having that perspective more so than any like one particular like skill that I learned while I was on the operating side is I think the most important thing that I took from that, how tough it is to build a company. I think like getting to support founders like in my current role, we're pretty exclusively lead investors, and so that comes along with the expectation of the governance, things like board seats, but also just being there for our founders and being able to support in any way that we can, whether that's let's help you think through hiring, let's talk through strategy, let's find people in our network that can be useful for whatever problem you're facing, whether that's being a therapist of sorts for our founders, because I think it can be a really lonely job. Trying to do something that's never been done before is exceptionally hard. And like, what can we do to support them and to be there for them?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense that founders do go through tons of stress, like you were mentioning. And while they're, while in media, you just see the ones that are lionized, right? You just see the successes. You don't see any of the failures. But for every success, I think to your point, you might see many times more failures than successes along the way. And even for the successful companies, they go through failures and pivots all the time. It's a key part of the journey.
Yeah, like there's so few things. I think if you look at any VC, like you think about your portfolio, like every single company has had something that's been like a pivot or like, oh, this is like, a really tough set of months. There's always those moments like in between, to that successful journey.
So let's talk about the founders that you're working with, and let's talk about Springtide. So what is it that you're focused on right now? Your portfolio has a diverse array of companies across the health tech spectrum, from some diagnostics, some clinical applied data sciences, some therapeutics, all platforms. So I'm curious if you could tell us about how you guys approach investments, what makes you decide to lead an investment, be on the board of some of these companies. What makes the companies exciting to you across all these different types that we talked about briefly?
That's a great question. So like in terms of our investment scope, we do seed and Series A investment, so pretty early stage across healthcare and life sciences. So we're about 50% traditional health tech investing. So like digital health, care delivery, healthcare IT, software that sells into payers, providers, pharma, any of those types of businesses. And there we typically look for companies that have a product, have started to generate revenue from at least one arm's length third party customer. And the other side of the house is deep tech in life sciences. So a lot of stuff that's probably relevant for the Nucleate crowd. So like TechBio platforms, your AI for drug discovery types of companies, devices, diagnostics, life sciences tools. We take a pretty broad perspective of like what's in scope for us. Really the only things that we don't tend to touch are asset centric. So like a small molecule company or like a single small molecule for a particular disease, like things that are like more traditional biopharma types of models. Like we're pretty platform driven there. And I would say like the number one thing, across both spaces that we look at is team. You're backing a person, you're backing a company and an idea and a vision, but like there has to be someone, kind of driving that. Like I think, I forget what VC said it, but like, A plus players with a B plus idea will, always beat a B plus team with an A plus idea. It's about executing and bringing that vision to life. And so, team is the first and kind of most important part of that. Obviously, market is really important too. We kind of have to underwrite our investments. We want something that can return our fund. So, what that looks like from a dollar's perspective is probably different for every, company, depending on how much you own and all the math that goes into that. But, we're looking for things that can be tomorrow's greatest healthcare companies, like that have that big vision and can, be $1 billion company, in a few years. And then of course, like, how are they doing it? Like, how does this compare to what's been done previously? Like, why have others in this space failed? Like, I think your point earlier was a really good one about, 20 years earlier or whatever it is, like, sometimes things aren't ready for prime time. Like, why is now going to be different?
How do you go about assessing these types of companies across all of these different domains, right? Each, I'm sure, has different risks, right? Like a clinical decision support tool using AI is going to be one set of risks that you're underwriting, to your point. And then on the other, we briefly talked before we started recording about debut biotech, which is, beauty industry, and it's related to the material sourcing. So each of those types of companies has different risk factors at play, all have innovative technology and large markets on the other side. But what kinds of risk do you take, and how do you assess that risk? Assuming that, like, hey, a lot of these are going to fail. I'm sure a lot of your companies are going to do great, but some of them will fail, right? So how do you figure out which risks you're willing to take on when you're going about building your portfolio?
Yeah, I mean, it's early stage investing, so like there's always risk. I mean, there's risk in any stage, right? But early stage, like there's things that are not particularly unique to any company. Like, okay, this is a maybe an unproven team, and those you kind of just have to have comfort around. I think it's about understanding, like, okay, well, what are the things that are going to be the risks within this time period? Like, what are the value accruing milestones as we go from seed to Series A? And like, how do we turn over those cards in a capital efficient, productive manner, so that oh, okay, yeah, there's what are the biology risks that we're taking here, and how are we going to mitigate them? Or how are we going to say, like, this is not going to be a risk moving forward because we're going to like do this set of experiments and kind of like prove that this works or whatever it is. And so I think it's, both about understanding like what are the risks, like they're always present, but then like how are we going to mitigate them, or like at least continue to try to mitigate them. So for some companies, like there's regulatory risk, like, okay, this has to go through, whatever FDA process it is, whether it's, okay, we're going to do new therapeutics, like, okay, that's a pretty defined set of, what you have to do, diagnostics, like something that's maybe like a novel product type. How are we going to figure out what the path forward is and like what that looks like and the implications for the company? So we'll take that risk. There's obviously always, like anytime you're looking at life sciences, like some sort of biology risk. Like biology is unpredictable and can be hard to control, and like your best laid plans can just evaporate in an instant because like experiments come back and it's like, oh, that was not really what we expected. So there's always that risk that's present, but it's, what are the killer experiments? How are we going to move the ball forward? And like kind of making sure that you're backing someone who has a plan and like will be able to execute and kind of like check those risks off as you build the company.
Yeah, and it sounds like too that you mentioned you have technical experience, biological engineering as a startup founder. So across those domains, sounds like you're able to offer that expertise from real life experiences, right? Hard to develop like a big sample size of experiments that companies do together, but having that hands-on experience as a consultant too, seeing a lot of different successful examples, I'm sure is extremely helpful as you're evaluating this, and I'm sure as your other partners are working on these projects as well.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think like, you at the end of the day, like we're not the operators, like we're not running these companies day to day. Like the founders are the experts and they're the ones that are like, doing the really like challenging things and kind of like, thinking through that. And so getting that trust and that comfort with those people through the diligence process, I think like also is really, really important. Like obviously you're asking questions to like, write your memo and figure out like what those risks are, or like, what the market is, what the upside is, like all the questions that you need to answer to get an investment done. But you're also assessing the founder and thinking like, is there trust? Is this someone that like I know will be able to do these really hard things, like check the box on all these risks, or is the right technical person for this job?
I think it'd be helpful for our audience. We talked through maybe a couple of examples from your portfolio of companies. We're not picking favorites here. These are going to be arbitrarily picked examples, right? Hard to pick a favorite. But we actually were talking a little bit about Paterna Biosciences before we started recording. I think that's a really interesting one. So I'm curious on how your approach to Springtide came to play for that one.
Yeah, definitely. And we don't have favorite children. We love all our portfolio companies, but Paterna is a really special one. This is a company that's developing methods for in vitro spermatogenesis. So basically, how do we make a sperm in a petri dish to go through the IVF process? And this was a company that came to us from the University of Utah, the top sperm biologists in terms of, understanding the differentiation process that happens. Like, how does a spermatogonial stem cell like become a sperm? So that expertise we felt really confident in. We really like the fertility space. We think there's a lot of important problems to solve there. Obviously, like people want to have children, and like IVF is a godsend for people, but it can be a really challenging process if it doesn't work out. Both emotionally and like financially, it's really expensive to go through. So like, how do you give yourself the best chance of success there? So we met the team. Like it's kind of an interesting one because it's like essentially a consumer cell therapy in a way. Like IVF is kind of consumer cell therapy if you think about it that way. Interesting regulatory path in that, like, this is something that's never been done before. So that was one of the things that we thought about, and we're like, yeah, this is a big, exciting market. This is a team with the right technical expertise, and we think this is a big problem we're solving. So basically what they do is, they take a spermatogonial stem cell from a biopsy, a testicle biopsy, and their goal is to make it so, they can differentiate that, go through mitosis, go through meiosis, and at the end of the day, have a sperm cell that they can then, put into IVF, do the ICSI process on, and lead to someone having a child, which is just a really beautiful and hopefully really impactful thing that they would be able to do, especially for the 1% of men who can't produce sperm cells naturally. Like they, in all likelihood, will have a really, they can't father a child biologically. And so for those men, like this would be, their only shot at that. And for men going through the IVF process, or, partners going through the IVF process, like having a better shot at success would be huge.
The impact, I think, is pretty clear on this one, that you'd enable men who wouldn't be able to genetically have a child on their own, be able to have a child biologically, which I think is fantastic. So I want to talk to you about Springtide's investment thesis a little bit more. Fundamentally, you're focused on platforms. And I think this is really interesting in the environment in 2025. Capital markets, for lack of a better word, suck. It's very challenging as an early stage investor to get funding. You guys are playing in a space where not many people play right now, like writing seed and earlier Series A checks and taking bets. And we've talked about this before, but you guys want founders who are focusing on their platforms early on. And I'd say we're generally in a capital constrained environment. A lot of investors outside of you guys are very focused on assets. They're like, what asset is your lead? How far along are you? When we're talking about therapeutics companies, and you invest in some platform-based therapeutics company. So what I admire is that you guys are counter-cyclical. You guys are going against the current wave of asset-focused companies and a lot of repurposed or in-licensed asset companies that are being developed. And you're still focused on platforms even in this environment. So I'm curious on how you guys have stayed the course on platforms, how you think about them, how you think they can continue to be successful in this challenging capital market. How are you approaching that?
Yeah, and I wish that it wasn't counter-cyclical. Like I wish that, I was competing with, every biotech-focused VC fund for these companies, because I think, there's a lot of platforms that are doing really important and impactful work and moving, science forward and our understanding of technology forward. And so, but I know that our world is, very cyclical as well. Like platforms come back into favor, assets fall out of favor. You just, wait a couple of years, right? Companies don't necessarily have the luxury of doing that. But, as investors, I'm sure if we were having this conversation, 5 years ago or, in 5 years, like we'd be, having a different spin on it. We are platform focused. We're not traditional biotech investors. We don't like the binary risk profile of like an asset centric company where like, your lead asset fails and all of a sudden like your value evaporates. So for us, it's just a question about risk and like the risk that we want to take. And platforms give you multiple shots on goal. Platforms give you the variety of business models, whether that's, turning into a traditional drug development company or whether that's, remaining in the platform stage, like Palantir style business models for biopharma. I think it's a really interesting area and opportunity. But I think there's a lot of really great investors that are asset centric and, more power to them. We're happy that they're, making great returns and like advancing medicine and, those therapeutics are leading to advances for patients, right? But from our perspective, like we want to invest in the platform. I think there's a little bit of a paradox or conundrum in the like, how do you show, especially with like AI driven things, like how do you show that this black box is spitting out things that are valuable? And then I think it forces the platforms to kind of, develop assets and like move those forward so that I can say like, yeah, my algorithm, generated this drug or generated this insight. And like, we tested it in mouse models and all of a sudden like it does work. So like, yes, this platform is valuable. So I think you have to do a little bit of both. I think, you have to kind of decide on the journey, like how much, effort and, money and time and, contributions you're going to put towards platform advancement versus like asset advancement. And I think some biotechs or some tech bio companies like, make the decision that the right thing for them is to focus on the asset because like that's the proof point for the broader platform. There are companies that, kind of say, well, no, I don't want to become a biotech. Like I'm going to work on, advancing the platform. And, there's companies that are kind of in the middle. And I think, from our thesis, like we want to feel that the platform has value and we want our raise to go towards advancing, the broader capabilities of the platform and building that vision. And, sometimes it's about, well, what's the right milestone for the company? And it does force you to go in sometimes like, maybe not like an asset centric direction, but like to developing an asset, right?
Well, a raise that you're leading says like go into advancing the platform, but that doesn't mean it's not going to develop assets, right? If you have an AI centric drug development platform, they may have a lead asset coming out of it, right? And that is an important thing, but that a lot of the investment dollars are going towards continuing to build out the platform in parallel. We covered a bunch of topics here, but I'm curious on unpacking one a little bit more briefly that the Palantir model in biotech could be interesting. And, you've said in the past that companies that look boring today but will be infrastructure tomorrow are compelling to you. Let's talk about that a little bit more. What does that mean to you?
I think it is really easy to have a bad experience with healthcare in this country. Like every single person listening to this podcast is like, immediately thinking of that moment where like, oh yeah, this bill shows up and I was on hold for 8 hours with like the billing department. Nobody knew what's going on. Like, everybody has a story like that. And I think, founders, like it's really easy if you're a smart, like entrepreneurial person to say like, oh, I can fix this. Like, yeah, I want to be able to book an appointment with my doctor, like using a web platform, like the same way that like, I book meetings on Calendly. Like, why doesn't that exist? And like, I think, it's easy to kind of run at those problems. Healthcare, life sciences, like we know that they're really complex. You start pulling on one thread and all of a sudden like, it leads to like 8 different insights and you keep pulling on those threads. And like, I think like the companies that I'm like most excited to back are the ones that like have pulled on those threads and like really gotten to the root cause of the issue or gotten to like the root cause of like, well, this is, if I do this, like all of a sudden it's going to solve these really like big, difficult problems. And so maybe that's, kind of like what I think of when you say like, look boring today, but will be infrastructure tomorrow. Like there are people who have like that deep earned experience or like earned insights on like all the incentives and really complexities of the healthcare system in this country. So that's something that like I always kind of look for when I'm looking at a company. Like, is it something that just like, yeah, you have a problem and you want to fix it? Or is it something where like there's a problem and you figure out the root cause and like, maybe that's like something that like is, deeply unsexy, but is a real problem. In terms of the Palantir style business models for biopharma, I think that's a space that I've gotten really excited about. I think obviously we've generated just tons and tons and tons of data, whether that's genomics data, whether that's clinical data that's sitting in charts that's like, the very definition of unstructured, right? If you can aggregate those big data sets, like now we can use LLMs to go through lots of unstructured data, right, and to get to an interesting place. If you can aggregate from institutions where they're kind of like sitting in walled gardens more or less, I think that you can get some interesting insights. And I think we're at a place where pharma is receptive to paying really meaningful amounts for okay, well, what's the biomarker we should be looking at for patient enrollment? Like, who are the patients we should be enrolling? Like, what are the targets we should be going after? Like, you can kind of paint the picture of like applications across multiple stages of drug development. And I think we are at a place where that's enabled, which is sort of a new business model for pharma if you think about it as like a high value thing rather than like one off, or like things like consulting, which like isn't really like venture scalable because it's like a person to person type of business.
That's a really interesting insight too. And having written some of those medical notes myself in medical school and as an intern, I can definitely say definitely unstructured. Now,
I'm sure yours were very structured.
There's a logical structure to it, but it's not structured data.
Yeah.
I get what you're saying. That's interesting though too. And I mean, also obviously HIPAA plays a big role in why those, like you said, they're walled gardens. There's a reason for that, for patient safety, and I think obviously there's going to be a lot of sensitivity to that. Like, how do you de-identify it but still make it useful for the platforms? I am curious to see how that all plays out too. Like, what kind of insights can you get from physicians' notes in addition with lab findings, and figure out, oh, like, this patient might actually have benefited from a drug that may not have been obvious at the time. Or certainly if you apply that, advanced data analytics to clinical trials, like, why is it that certain patients respond to drugs whereas others don't? So I can definitely see applications like that. Is that how you're thinking about it? Or how would a company build around this kind of Palantir model that you're describing?
I think you hit the nail on the head. Like, there's just a lot of different things that you can imagine. Like, if I can amass like 1 million patient records, if I can amass, pathology findings of like, every cancer patient at MD Anderson, like, there's going to be interesting insights that are there that if we can look at scale and like, use algorithms in a wise way to like pick out those insights, like, there's going to be like interesting things that are going to lead to better patient care. They're going to lead to, whether that's new drugs or like new ways of treating or new ways of thinking about like, well, here's how I should be using antibody drug conjugates in these patients, or I should be using, this is a good patient for, radiation or whatever it is. Like, I think there's insights that will be gleaned there. It's about, to your point, and maybe this is like, the boring part of it, like, how do you deal with HIPAA and patient privacy? Like, how do you set up all those things so that like you can use the data? How do we make sure that we're not like, collecting data sets that are somehow biased or like leading to, greater disparities in patient care? I think those are probably like broader ethical questions that like we have to think about, or like, at least be cognizant of as we're building, how do we make sure this is moving the ball forward for everybody?
I want to pivot a little bit and talk about broader trends. So Springtide, you guys call yourselves TechBio investors. I don't know if you know Joe Horsman at Madrona, but he says, oh, TechBio should be retired as a term. Usually when I think of TechBio, it means that, there's some sort of hardcore data science component. It's not like we talked about at the beginning, it's not a traditional therapeutics approach, that there's some hardcore data approach. It can apply broader to health tech. It can apply broader to diagnostics involved in healthcare. But it's not your traditional, like you said, small molecule company or series of small molecules. It's going to be more, I would say like usually thematically data science enabled technologies, etc. And there's usually some sort of moat around said data, right? I'm curious on what TechBio means to you and how you guys think about it.
That's a great question, because I think if you ask 10 people, like, what does TechBio mean? Like, you'll probably get really, really different answers from every single person, right? And maybe, I don't know if that's a good thing. TechBio is a term that, like, I think when I first heard it, I was just, like, totally turned off. I was like, this isn't, why can't biotech just be a thing? Like, we don't need to differentiate ourselves. And I've come around, I've warmed up on it. Like, I use that to describe what we do and what I'm interested in. When I think about traditional biotech, I think about, like, okay, I'm starting with a biological insight, like whether that's a target to be drugged or like, okay, I have this way of generating antibodies. And then you have like a toolbox of, different technologies that you can go and use to like interrogate the biology or like develop a drug. Like, we know how to do that, right? When I think about TechBio, I think about it as tech first. So like, okay, I have this, whether it's like a software platform or like this, hardware device, actual physical product. Like, how do I then go use that to solve biological problems? Like maybe it's, we're starting with the hammer and saying like, where do I go for this? Like, what are the nails? So it's, the tech is core to everything that they do versus, okay, well, we're going to be a biotech that's, focused on like this particular target or particular like disease or set of targets, whatever it is. I think there's probably a gray area. I don't think this is like this beautiful MECE segmentation where like, this is a biotech company and this is a tech bio company and like they'll never meet. I talked to an investor a couple of years ago who said one of the like great, issues with the term tech bio is like at the time, like when companies grow up, like they become biotech companies. I don't know if that's the case anymore, which is probably a good thing. Like there are, new and emerging business models, whether that's the Palantir of pharma or whether that's, interesting software plays and things like that. But I think it is still true for a lot of companies. Like they're going to grow into traditional biotech companies that are going to kind of fit neatly in that existing classification.
I assume they're going to move faster than your traditional pharma, though, assuming that they're leveraging AI analytics, etc. I think Formation Bio uses a lot of AI in their tool sets, and I think a lot of bigger pharmas, some of them are starting to leverage AI in drug development.
Mm-hmm.
I am curious on how you're thinking about that, though. Have you seen a lot of big pharma starting to adopt this stuff? Have your portfolio companies partnered with larger pharma? How do you see the industry evolving as far as AI-enabled drug development?
I think there's probably like a pretty broad spectrum of like, the AI believers to like the AI skeptics. Like I talk a lot about the differences between like East Coast venture and, West Coast venture in terms of like familiarity and comfort, and like maybe that's like belief that like the AI moment is here for biotech. I'm based in Boston. I believe the AI moment is here for biotech, and I think that makes me like a little bit of a contrarian if you look at like the broader like Boston, New England, like East Coast landscape of venture capital and like where people are interested in. But I think like everybody uses ChatGPT, right? Like what it can do, and like people just like understand LLMs, and I think that's helpful because it's like, okay, these are really powerful things. Like, okay, like where do we go from here? Like maybe that's using it to do biostats or like medical writing or like, there's pretty obvious like next jumps that like people don't have to have like total comfort with. Like, LLMs are going to like generate antibodies or like something that like people think of as like very complex. Like you need scientists, you need to do this like the traditional way. And I think every pharma company, every biotech company, every VC is like probably somewhere on that spectrum of like AI comfort and belief. And I think, as we see more drugs move into clinical trials, as we see like, more companies kind of like looking under the hood at some of these like interesting plays, there'll be more and more comfort. And it's, just like, let's move the ball forward.
Yeah, no, that's a great point, though. I've seen some pretty impressive developments from companies like Sean McLean's Absci. We talked to Joe Betts-Lacroix at RetroBio, who's directly working with OpenAI, speaking of LLMs. So there's some very interesting, innovative approaches to using AI. I think for, perhaps some people, I may be more enmeshed in the Boston ecosystem. So we're all like interested in AI, but we're waiting for like the real proof points. We're waiting for some approved drugs to come out. But, there's a lot of promise, right? Like there's a lot of ideas around how it could accelerate drug development, increase the probability of success at each stage of development. It seems like there's some, I would say, green shoots. It seems like it's being adopted by larger pharmas. I know Novartis has done some partnerships with AI-enabled companies. So I am curious to see how it plays out. It seems like, I would say it's definitely still early days. The potential seems to be there, but what would you think would need to happen for everyone to say like, yeah, the moment is like fully here. It's the first drug developed using an AI system? Is it the first drug optimized using an AI system? When do you think like you'll say like, oh, the moment's arrived, or this is like a real big marker of the moment arriving in AI and biotech?
Oh man, that's a great question. There's probably always going to be skeptics. There's always going to be like scientists who've trained their whole life and done things one way and very set in their ways, like, really traditional biotech gray hair, right? We're never going to move away from chemists at a bench. And like, we're probably never going to move away fully from chemists at a bench, right? I think like approved drugs is the easiest and most logical proof point. Like, okay, AI designed something, we put it into people, it worked. But I think in the meantime, like there's more like interim wins. Like, okay, this platform spit out something that we put into mice and like it did what it said it would, and like we would have otherwise like not discovered this. Maybe that's a target that like was identified by AI and we ran like a traditional screening campaign off of. maybe that was, a molecule that like we used AI to generate against a target that was like discovered in traditional ways. Like I think it's not like, this end to end, like, AI is going to like do all of the things for the first drug program and like then it's going to be like this beautiful proof point. I think it's, okay, AI is going to replace this step in it or augment this step in it or, help you understand like, this is going to be a safety issue. So like, let's tweak this molecule a little bit or whatever it is. I think everybody probably has their own like unique thing where it's like, okay, if AI could do that, like I would be impressed. But I think, it's going to be like little pieces along the journey that will like be the first way of getting it in these things.
To the point on the skeptics, there's a lot of AI companies and a lot of people who slap AI on a label, but it's actually machine learning. And a lot of people don't even know the difference anyway. But how do you separate out what are truly innovative AI platforms versus ones that are, maybe it's a wrapper of some sort, or maybe it's like not a transformative innovation? How do you identify companies that are really making a material step in the use of AI versus leveraging technology that's already well understood?
I mean, I'm completely having flashbacks to like 2 or 3 years ago when like, we had like the first real like broad awareness of ChatGPT, and all of a sudden like every company would like come in and they had like a slide about AI, and you'd be like looking at it going like, okay, like you're running like basic statistics, like that's not AI, that's like using Excel, or like using Python or using R thoughtfully. Like great, like you should be doing that, but like that's not like AI machine learning. Like people just wanted to get that like uplift of like, this is a cool, deeply sexy thing that everybody's really excited about that's going to transform the world. Like let's put AI into this. I don't think you see as much of that, which is a good thing. Like people come in with like deliberate, well thought out AI strategies, like, and I think you kind of have to think like, how is this going to be, a useful tool or a potential competitor or like impact my business? Because like, it's kind of everywhere for better or worse. Like that cat's out of the bag. Like you have to be aware of it and you have to like be at least like have a thoughtful response to that. The things I look for, like obviously there's like a lot of wrappers, which I don't think of as like a dirty word or like, a no-go. It's, how are you differentiating yourselves? Like, is it because you have better data? Are you able to generate data that's going to lead to better, stronger algorithms, like better, stronger insights that come out of those? That can be really differentiating. I think every company and like what they're trying to do is like a little bit unique. So it's like, well, what is your angle? Like, why are you going to win with this approach?
That makes a lot of sense, that there's going to have to be some clear differentiation, like you mentioned, from other technologies that have existed before. I assume data moats are really important, that there's some unique data being inputted, so that's hard to replicate by other AIs. Or perhaps someone who's not as advanced in their AI knowledge, like what are the kinds of things that are like a telltale sign, like, okay, this is really unique, right? Like this is a unique approach to the data analytics that you're doing, or like what you're generating out of with your AI, or this is a unique data set. Like how are you splitting it out?
We invested in a company called Leash Bio, which uses DNA encoded libraries to generate data for machine learning. And for that investment, it was, a combination of factors. Like first, it's an incredible team who really, know what they're doing and have deep domain expertise. And also DNA encoded libraries are ideal for generating huge amounts of data. And what do we need for machine learning and what do we need for small molecule development? Like small molecule generation is really, really complex. There's like basically infinite combinations of things you could put together that are drug-like. And they were able to generate like bigger data sets than have ever been seen in terms of protein small molecule interactions, where like that's a really powerful moat. So that's, kind of the example that first comes to mind in terms of like, this is, an AI investment. That's their unique advantage. I think they also are exceptionally thoughtful about doing things the right way in terms of, training sets versus test sets and like keeping, those completely separate, which I think like a lot of companies, aren't quite so thoughtful about. And it leads to like memorization, which like, great, that's not going to move the ball forward, to use my favorite analogy. I think it's also like team and expertise, are these people who really understand and will be able to like out execute other founders that are, trying to use AI to solve the same problem. What's the advantage there?
But yeah, I mean, it makes sense, right? Like to the point that you're saying, like, how do you separate out, like, is it that the AI has incorporated all data that's ever existed, so it's just regurgitating something that's already been seen before? Or is it actually making something novel, which I think is obviously the key in these situations? I want to pivot a little bit. You talked a lot about the difference between East Coast and West Coast investors, and I think it's a logical jump from AI to talk about this. My sense of the thing is that people on the East Coast believe in AI. Obviously, a lot of West Coast folks are like, we're only going to invest in AI, or it's a requirement that you have really novel AI approaches. And the East Coast teams, at least from my experience in venture, are going to be like really deep into pharmacokinetics data when it comes to drug development. They're going to like dig into like the mechanistic research, whereas I think at the West Coast, classically, you're going to see a lot more hype around AI. I am curious on how you've seen that. It sounds like you're kind of like a hybrid. You're like a unique combination where you're excited about, the tech applications in therapeutics. But yeah, how have you seen that play out between East Coast and West Coast investors in healthcare?
I think that's a completely fair characterization. Like, it's all about like what sort of things you look for when you do the investment, where it's like, what are the proof points here? And like, I agree with you. Like, the East Coast isn't like dismissive of AI in like a, oh, this isn't happening type of way. But I think there's a lot more skepticism around, especially applying it to like a lot of, discovery or preclinical types of functions versus the West Coast, where like, you see, if you look at like a Bay Area VC, like, they're surrounded by Bay Area VCs that are investing in like the bleeding edge of AI tech, like outside of life sciences and healthcare. Like, and so I think it's easier for them to, maybe get excited about that because it's like, it's all around you, right? Versus Boston, which I think is a much more biotech driven ecosystem, where like, you look at the East Coast, like, I think there is a little bit more, okay, well, like, I want to see, data, like, put this into cells, like, or, show me something that I can, like, grasp and understand versus like, okay, I'm going to kind of take this at face value in terms of like the algorithm doing something. I think it goes more like back to our discussion about like platforms versus assets, and like assets are the easiest way of, if I'm diligencing something, like, okay, I can look at asset data and say, yeah, this looks good. This looks like what I would expect or want to see, versus like having to kind of fundamentally change your diligence process to like look at something that's a little bit more like nebulous or a little bit more, unlike things that you've seen in the past, like you can't like pattern match as well.
Now, and I'm curious, as you're supporting all these companies, including the AI focused companies in your portfolio, in a tight capital market like we've been talking about, how are you advising them as they navigate this pretty challenging environment in terms of maintaining focus, making sure they're being as capital efficient as possible? You mentioned earlier, like making sure they're running that killer experiment, but fundamentally in this time versus say 3 or 4 years ago in 2021, how are you advising companies to navigate this more capital constrained environment?
Yeah, it's been a tough couple of years, coming off of like unprecedented wild boom times, right, in 2020, 2021. And I think, founders that are saying like, okay, well, what are the milestones I need to hit to make my Series A raise happen? And those goalposts have maybe shifted a little bit. People are in tight capital markets, like, VCs start to have a little bit more power to say like, no, we want to see a little bit more like meat on the bone here. We want to see these experiments or see like these data be generated before we be comfortable investing, versus like, if you look at 2021, where there's like FOMO is real, like you don't want to like take more time and realize you missed the deal, right? And so I think like, how do you make sure, if you're a founder, like, am I doing the killer experiments? Is every single thing that I'm doing going towards milestones that like are value creating or value accruing, versus like doing things because they're like cool science? Like, we all love cool science. Like, probably everybody listening to this podcast is like nodding and going like, yeah, that's like, I want to read, interesting things or like do, crazy bleeding edge things, but like, are they for your company? Like, is that adding value like towards those goals that you kind of set out? And I think, really thoughtful founders will kind of take those cool science things as like thought experiments, and then we'll say like, no, if we had like, if you have $100 million extra dollars, like this is how you would go off and do it, but like that's not how I'm telling my story to the market. What do investors want to see at the next stage, and building towards that?
So being very capital efficient, focused on what milestones you need to hit. I think the challenging part is probably what you hit on briefly, which is that the goalposts may have changed from when you last received money.
Mm-hmm.
So you might have to go farther than you thought you could. You have to be very, sounds like very rigorous about how you decide how to use your money, and probably use it more cautiously than you would if we were in another 2021 type of environment.
Yeah, I mean, it's probably, always true that like you want the raise to take like 5 minutes. You always kind of have to plan for things taking a little bit longer, whether that's because like, capital markets aren't like booming. Like, so there's not that dynamic of like, oh, if I talk to a company, like they will have received a term sheet in a week. So like I need to move really quickly. So things are just going to take a little bit longer. Like that's probably true about like every milestone that you lay out too. Like, you have these plans and then like turns out biology is complex, or like turns out it's really tough to like sell into pharma or whatever it is. Like, giving yourself a little bit of that buffer, or planning at least for things to take, longer than they would ideally, is always helpful too, versus like kind of running to like a crazy aggressive timeline that like requires, every single thing to work perfectly. Like there's always roadblocks or like things that are out of your control and a lot of that stuff.
There's a lot of people in our audience who are earlier stage founders. They may be still in the lab. They might be doing their postdoc, and they're deciding whether to spin out their company. And, as we mentioned, very challenging to raise, money right now. I mean, I've had some mentees from Nucleate have challenges raising in this environment. So I'm curious, like for the folks that are still in academia and they're deciding when to launch their startup and they're nervous about it, how would you advise someone who's, still in the lab, haven't really formally started their company yet, but they're on the cusp of it?
That's a great question. I mean, I think there's probably never like a great time, right? Like if you try to time it too much, like, you look at the markets and you say like, yeah, that's really difficult. Okay, well, in 5 years, like, is it going to be the right time for your technology, or like, are people kind of, have moved on, right? So I think, you can't be too cutesy about that, unfortunately. I think having conversations with like investors that, would be funding those things, like having honest conversations and seeking honest feedback. Like, is this something that's actually fundable? Whether that's right now, whether that's in general, like kind of interrogating that is probably a useful next step. Like, how would I structure this company? Like, what do I need from a pre-seed perspective or from an angel perspective? Like, what does the next, like, if I were to go out and launch, like, what are the milestones I need to hit? Because it's difficult to move something from an academic environment into a company. Like, things don't always behave the way you want them to. Like, all of a sudden, if you're looking to create a drug, like, you have to think about like GMP, and you have to think about like this whole broader set of considerations. So like, just like, what is the plan and how would you, spin that out? And then thinking thoughtfully, like, well, is this, because you're unlikely as a first time founder, like moving something out of academia, to get like a $50 million check from someone. And if you could do it, like, great, more power to you, and I support you all the way. But like realistically, like, what's the amount of capital that you'd be able to raise, and like, where does that get you? And like, is that what, the seed stage investors will then be looking for? So to the extent that you can get those, feedback points from, whether that's friendly VCs, whether that's from Nucleate, whether that's from your mentor, try to take that in and to seek, really honest, candid feedback at every turn.
Effectively test drive it, right?
Yeah.
See what investors say before you're formally pitching them. Be like, is this a fundable idea right now? If not by you, by someone else, and developing a pretty robust business plan before jumping out into this environment. I mean, I agree with you generally. Like, there's never going to be a perfect time to jump in.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's better times than others, though. I think seed and Series A, my understanding is have just dropped like 70% from some of those high water marks. So it's definitely a more challenging time. I think good science continues to get funded, but I think there's plenty of good science that doesn't in this environment. That's really unfortunate, right? And I mean, like, the fact that some grant funding is drying up is obviously not the best for aspiring founders. I think grant funding really, and it's still flowing for some people, don't get me wrong. I know that, NIH and SBIRs are still being issued, but it's definitely harder now, is my understanding fundamentally. And that makes it harder to, the classic model of the postdoc developing something in a lab funded by grants, gets to like a pretty reasonable inflection point, and then goes over to private investors. I think some folks coming out of academia are getting, hit on both sides, right? They're not getting the grant funding that they would typically be able to get access to, and the private capital markets are more challenging. So it's harder to, especially for first-time founders or earlier stage founders, to go out there and start a company. But I think your advice still is consistent for them too, right? Like, at least test drive your idea, find some investors, get some feedback, develop the plan that you'd want to go out to. And if you're getting feedback that it's overwhelmingly not the right time across the board, maybe you have to reevaluate your ideas and your plans.
Totally. I mean, and I think it's, maybe not always like you're going to get the feedback, but like, no, don't start this company. Like, this is useless. But like, you're going to get the feedback of like, hey, I kind of need to see more developed planning in terms of like what your business is going to look like. Like, are you going to be like an asset company? And like, how do you, develop those proof points or like run those experiments, like, or is this, a really crowded space where like, I'm not particularly interested in, this target or this disease area, but I am really interested in this. And like, to the extent that you can get those proof points and start like, building your company in a way that like people will want to fund it and it will be something that they'll like hear and they'll be like, yeah, like I've been looking for something, versus like, oh yeah, I've heard 50 pitches on that and like, it's never going to work. And you get, I think, probably more candid feedback when you're like talking to people and you're not raising, versus like, when you're raising and, people, oh, hey, I don't think this is right for us. Versus like, if someone comes to me and says, I just want you to tell me like, all your feedback about this pitch, like, great, like, let's go. I'll ask the questions and tell you what I think, and hopefully that's helpful.
A little tangential, but I want to hit on this. You talk about getting a lot of pitches. What makes a good pitch, right? Is you're going, even if you're not formally pitching, right? You're not in a fundraising mode necessarily. Mm-hmm. What do you think separates out those founders who can talk about their companies? I'm sure you've come across plenty of scientifically oriented founders who are just used to, presenting in their lab meetings. Mm-hmm. Now they're presenting to you or another VC. I'm curious, what do you think separates out the best pitches versus the perhaps mediocre ones? And I'm sure, not just shine and charisma. I mean, like, what is it about that they're talking about that drives their pitch? Even if you decide not to invest it and say like, I decide not to invest in this company, but like they really understand their product well, and this is going to be a fit for someone, mm-hmm. and they really have their pitch nailed down. I'm curious, how would you advise a founder to really develop an excellent pitch?
I love this question. I think there's definitely a big difference between like the types of talks that you see at like name your scientific conference of choice, like name your lab meeting of choice, versus like a pitch. And I think that's probably like a difficult switch for people to flip or to like adjust their style to. The biggest piece of advice that I love to give really early stage founders is like, your goal of that first conversation isn't to get a check, like it's to get a second conversation. I mean, some angels will write a check after like the first meeting, like some venture groups probably do, like especially in really heated and hot spaces. But like, for me, like, I meet the founder, we have a 30-minute conversation, and then I'm like, okay, am I gonna, go into my partner meeting on Thursday morning and say like, we need to have another conversation with this company. Like, this is great. Like, I need, all of you guys to meet this person because like, this was just such a compelling pitch. And I think like, if you approach it from that mindset, like, what do I need to tell the VC to like get them to understand my idea? First and foremost, like, you go through a lot of pitches where, you kind of leave at the end of it and you're like, it took me like 20 minutes to understand like what this company does. That's a problem, right? I have to be able to articulate and pitch it in like a couple minutes to my partnership to say like, yes, this is really interesting. And so, if you approach it from like, what do I need to do to get the next meeting? Like, what are the key points that I need to make sure that you remember, that you know about this company? And I think one of the like interesting exercises that I've done with some founders in my portfolio before is like, we're going to pair off and I'm going to tell you my pitch for 5 minutes or whatever it is. And then you have 2 minutes to tell me like, what are the key points you retained from that, or to summarize it. And then I have a minute to pitch you again, because like, and then, you give me 30 seconds, like, this is kind of what I remember. Because I think there's a tendency to just like, I want to tell you everything about my company. Like, I'm super excited about it. Like, this is my life's work. And that's awesome. But I think sometimes that means that like the big key points get lost in the details. And so, what are the 3 things, Sam, that I need you to know about what Springtide does at the end of this conversation? And if like, if we do that exercise and there's a disconnect, like, okay, well, how do I need to tell this story differently? The best pitches aren't often ones where like someone talks at you for like 25 minutes. The best pitches are ones where you're like having a little bit of a dialogue, like, I'm kind of understanding enough about your company to get excited about it, but like, I want to have those other conversations and dig really deeply into your, scientific data, or dig really deeply into like the way that you're thinking about the markets, like, because I think this is really compelling. And so, what do I need to tell you to like enable you to understand, versus like, kind of dumping every piece of data that I've ever generated, because like there's a time and a place for that, and it's not often the first conversation.
Yeah, and to your point on people getting lost in the details, I feel like when you're presenting to other scientists at a scientific conference, kind of like you alluded to, it's all about the data, mm-hmm. right? It's about building, and I think too in medicine, we had to do this where you had to build up the story from start to end, like what are the pieces of data and why did it all come together, and then at the end get to your conclusion and how it all connects together. And I think in science as well, it's also like, tell me the story from beginning to end logically. Whereas I feel, I'm sure you experienced this in consulting, I'm sure, the best pitches do this, you have to be answers first. You have to, instead of walking through all the data and get to the point at the end, you have to bring the point to the beginning and say what the critical pieces are to know. And then based on the amount of time you have, you can go into the level of detail you need
Mhm.
to support that piece. But my sense of it, honestly, is like whether it's a 30-second pitch or a 30-minute pitch, you still want to hit the first few points at the beginning, right? Like, what are the three most important points? Usually it's groups of three. If you listen to the CEO of BCG, they classically do this. It's always got to be three things. It's got to stick in people's minds better. You should know what those three things are, regardless of the length. Hit those points early, and then you're going to tailor how much detail you go into based on the length of the pitch.
100%. And I'm glad that you brought up BCG, like, because, as you were talking, the first thing that came to mind, and like, shout out to one of my old bosses who suggested this book to me, but is the pyramid principle, which is like out of, I think a McKinsey partner wrote it in like the 70s. And it talks about like, how do you story tell in that way that like, here's the most important point. Here are the three things that support that versus the way that like, I think, science tends to naturally flow as like, this piece, this piece, this piece, I'm building up to my story. But if you tell your story like the other way around, I think it can be more compelling. Like I try to think about that when I'm writing like my investment memos. Like, okay, this is the thesis. Like point, 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 point. It's like, look, it's not a book that's like going to keep you up at night as a real page turner, but it's a really useful way of thinking and telling your story.
I'll put you on spot a little bit. What are the three big points about Springtide you'd want our audience to remember?
That is a great question. I've actually never been asked that before. I think most importantly, we'll invest in anything that aligns with our mission of elevating health. Kind of at that intersection of science, technology, business, healthcare. We invest in traditional health tech, we invest in deep tech and life sciences, and we invest in companies that like we look at and we say this is impactful and important for health, which I think is fairly different from like your average health tech fund that is looking at payer and provider focused solutions. Like it's different from your traditional biotech fund, and I think that puts us at sort of like a really unique space. I'll give my favorite example here is a company in our portfolio called TrueMe, which makes safer smartphones for kids. Like it's a consumer cell phone company. Obviously, like we're starting to understand just kind of how much we've screwed up with social media, giving kids access to all of the like terrible things online, but like we want to be able to like use the good benefits of the internet, good benefits of like smartphones. So that's a company that's hopefully making that world safer and better for our kids from a behavioral health perspective. Like I think that's a deal that Springtide did that maybe a lot of healthcare funds wouldn't have like initially looked at and said like that's healthcare. So I think that's the biggest way that I would articulate our differences and articulate what our really unique advantage is. The second thing is our team. I think being an investor and kind of like pounding the table about like team being the most important. I think we all bring a pretty unique background and set of experiences to the table, and that allows us to get into some interesting places. So, my background's more on the computational biology side of things, pharma and biotech. We have payer experience, we have policy experience, we have all kind of like that operator DNA, having spent time in those spaces. And I think that's, really impactful and allows us to invest in a pretty broad set of categories. And the third point about Springtide is, normally I don't like to talk aggressively about like, yeah, we're so helpful in our portfolio companies. I would rather let our founders speak for ourselves. And I love making those intros as part of the diligence process because like, I can sit here and tell you how great I am, but like, I want you to talk to someone that we've worked with and have them say like, this is how Springtide helped me. That is a real important pillar of all of our day-to-day is portfolio support. Like we are here for our founders. Like that is, our number one priority is supporting the people that we've invested in. And that takes a different flavor, for every single founder in our portfolio. Everybody has their strengths and weaknesses and things that they like, have never done before or like want our help on. But like, you call, we're answering the phone, we know what's going on in your company and we want to be helpful. And like, that is just such a core part of our DNA.
And I think the founders in our audience can learn about how you effectively did that. One thing I did notice is that you're very candid. And I think that goes a long way too, is that you come across very authentic. And I think, we've talked about this a little bit in the sense of pitching, that you don't want to come off, there's this balance of like, you want to be polished, you want to understand your material well, but you don't want to be polished to the point where you sound robotic or you sound like it's canned or you sound like I'm reciting a line or reading a script.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that goes a long way too, is being able to have an authentic connection with your audience, speak from the heart. And I think that like know your material, of course, like you do, but speak from the heart because that does go a long way, I think, to connect to your audience.
Yeah, I mean, I think, assessing a team is really complex. And I think like, how do you figure out if there's trust and like whether this is someone you want to work with? And I think like founders, maybe going back to your question about like, how do you have a really good first intro meeting? I love it when you ask a question and someone's like, I don't know, like, or admitting like, hey, I don't, like, let me get back to you on that. And like, then having the follow up, or like, yeah, that's a really good question. Like, we haven't had the time to like, interrogate that or do these experiments or like, figure out like what this market is or whatever it is. But like the fact that they're admitting that, you're like, okay, this is someone who's not going to like try to like pull the wool over my eyes or like deflect or something. Obviously, there are questions where like it's not good to say you don't know. I think it can be a little bit of a flag of like every, if you ask like a bunch of, pretty like basic scientific questions and they're like, oh, like, well, let's have a conversation with my CSO. It's like, no, 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 like you need to know these details about your company. But like, kind of understanding like, is this someone that like when things get hard, like they're going to call me, or is this someone who's going to like try to paint a rosy picture? Like you try to like build that trust and like have that relationship like from day one.
So effectively, don't fake it till you make it. I mean, fake, if you need to, fake the confidence if you need to.
Yeah.
But don't, we had this conversation with Peter Barrett. He said, don't fake it till you make it. Don't lie to your board. Don't lie to investors. And I think there's been examples of, classically Forbes 30 under 30. There's some like very high profile founders. I think there was one who had like this like list of, potential, if I remember correctly, potential clients or people on this mailing list, and she inflated the numbers dramatically, and it was found out she was a fraud after the fact. That's one classic example. I forgot the name of that person. I'll link it afterwards. In this situation, be honest, right? Like be candid, and obviously be prepared, like you were saying. Understand your company well, but if you don't have an answer to a question that an investor asks, like tell them the truth. Like, here's what I know. To partially answer your question, I will get back to you on this specific point. I think that's a reasonable approach to be honest and candid with them.
Yeah, I mean, Forbes 30 under 30. That's I'm glad we're giving press to this popular person. Yeah, you can't really fake it in bio. You can't fake it in healthcare. Like, don't fake it till you make it.
As we wrap up here, let's do some quick fire questions. Just say the first thing that comes to your mind. If you weren't in biotech or venture, what unrelated field would you be in?
Peloton instructor.
If you could go back to school and audit a class on any subject, what would it be?
If there's any lawyers listening to this, I'm sure they're going to like totally cringe at my words here. I think it would be super fun to go to law school if like, in this like world where, my VC career is wildly successful. And I'm like, that would just be like fun. I think if you went like, not with the pressure of like, making it into big law and making partner, but just like, understanding the law, I think it would be super interesting.
All right, and the last question, and you already recommended a book, so I'll give you the out of Pyramid Principle, but are there any books you'd recommend our audience read and why?
I love this question. I think the book that every like person who thinks that they're like smart and like understands the world and like, should read When Genius Failed, which is the story about long-term capital management, which, failed in the 90s, this big hedge fund, and like, almost took down like the global financial markets, because it's this, set of quants, this set of like PhDs who are like, we are smarter than everybody. We're going to see these opportunities that like nobody else understands. We're going to out execute. And like they did, and they were really successful for a while until they weren't, until like all these outside factors started happening. And like, they were exceptionally levered. Like I forgot what the number is, but it's like totally staggering. And I think it's just like a cautionary tale of like, yeah, you might think you're smarter than everybody, but like, you've got to be careful.
And on that note, thank you so much for joining the Nucleate podcast, Claire.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for having me. This has been a lot of fun.
Thanks for listening to the Nucleate podcast. Be sure to subscribe if you'd like to keep up with future episodes. See you next time.